So, today, in the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, its Speaker, put a blanket prohibition on any discussion about the case in Southport. He did so, he says, because there's now a legal case unfolding in the courts against this so-called Welshman under Biological Weapons Act and anti-terror legislation, and he wouldn't wish to compromise that process. But he must surely know, as I'm sure does the Prime Minister and Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, that there are many questions that need to be answered about the case that have no bearing specifically on the proceedings that are now going through the courts. And if it isn't clear to him what those questions are, let me enumerate them now. The first question is, what did the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and Merseyside Police know back in July about this so-called Welshman? Did they know that he was in possession of ricin? Did they know he was in possession of Al-Qaeda workbooks? And if they knew this, why didn't they make it plain to the British people at the time, as they now have done? Why didn't they make it plain? Why didn't they also make it plain that if they knew all this, that they would ensure that the full force of the law would be brought to bear against this individual, and that the British people would be protected from his terroristic inclinations? I can tell you now that if they had made such declarations back in July, the riots which ensued, the protests which ensued, would not have taken place. The British people would have felt the protective blanket of the government and of the authorities around them, and they would have allowed due process to take place. But the British people could sense back in July that things weren't right, that they weren't being given the full picture. And a lot of what Yvette Cooper at the time described as misinformation would now appear to be bang on the money. The second question that particularly the Prime Minister needs to answer is, if he knew that this individual was in possession of ricin and Al-Qaeda workbooks, why it is he categorised the protesters as far right. And I'm not for a moment legitimising the rioting. Of course the rioting was wrong, but the protests themselves were categorised by the Prime Minister as far right. But again, it would seem, given what we now know, that the protests were bang on the money. The protesters were raising legitimate questions to which we still want answers. And Lindsay Hoyle should not have shut down debate in the House of Commons today. He should have invited the Prime Minister to explain why it is he politicised the protesters, categorised them as far right, and then directed the criminal justice system against them in full force. People have been arrested, people have been charged and put in jail. One individual has died in jail because of what they said in the protests and online. This is very, very serious. It is not just that questions shouldn't be asked, it is that questions must be asked of the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, Merseyside Police, and now I'm afraid about the Speaker of the House of Commons himself. We must ask these questions, and these questions must be answered. The British people need to feel the protective blanket of the state. It is not the Prime Minister and Yvette Cooper and the Merseyside Police that need the protective blanket of Lindsay Hoyle. It is us, the British people, that need to be protected. And unless that protective blanket is felt, unless we, the British people, feel that the authorities and the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary are being honest with us, the seeds of discontent will be further sown, and they will reap the ill winds of those seeds that they are allowing to be sown if they don't nip this problem in the bud. So what I say to Lindsay Hoyle, the Prime Minister, and Yvette Cooper and Merseyside Police is, for goodness sake, come clean with the British people. What did you know? Why didn't you put a protective blanket around the British people? Why is a protective blanket being put around the Prime Minister, Yvette Cooper and Merseyside Police? These are legitimate questions. They need to be answered. And for goodness sake, answer them before the British people demand answers in a way that is less than pleasant.